Mutation Genesis from the Fempiror Chronicles by George Willson. Chapter 5. Kelïrum. Kelïrum was a simple little town that, like many other towns on the European landscape, stood isolated from much of the outside world. It had common wood and brick buildings scattered along the single dirt road that crossed through town, with a series of houses further out along the many branches off the main road. By day there would be nothing interesting about this place. The night marked the one difference between this town and others that David and Beth had passed on their silent flight. Towns like Kelïrum that have a significant Fempiror population never sleep. While it did not have a large number of people out, people walked from one place to another across the road. They carried purchases, talked in the street with others, and lived their lives as if living at night were the most normal thing in the world. But unlike the Fempiror world that Zechariah had introduced David to in Aram, Kelïrum did not use the Fempiror lighting system. Instead, torches rested on the walls of the buildings and holders, which created an eerie line of shadow down the center of the street where the lights failed to reach. Many people carried self-lighting torches, similar to the one used by the Alewo guide in the underground meeting place, to light their way in the darker paths of the town. At David and Beth's approach in the early morning hours of the 13th, several people glanced up and stared. Though Tiberius had told them that the people of Kelïrum were used to newcomers, David wondered how often these newcomers arrived, or what might have happened here since Tiberius had learned this. Various people on the road turned away from David and Beth and disappeared into the various buildings that lined the road. Whatever that reaction meant, they had been seen. It was time to put the past behind them and work together. Beth leaned over to David. "Put your arm around me," she whispered. David looked at her surprised. Perhaps the talk coming into town was more beneficial than he thought. "Really?" he said. She rolled her eyes. "We're supposed to be a couple," she reminded him. He nodded. Of course, that was the reason. They needed to look like a happily married couple caught up in a bad situation. It might even help the less than favorable reaction the town had already given them. He complied, and quite happily wrapped his arm around her waist. Much to his dismay, however, she did not respond to his touch in any way. David knew he needed to put the thought of her warming up to him out of his mind for now. They were here for a reason, and he needed to focus on that reason. For a moment he cursed Tiberius for pairing them together. Surely both he and Ulrich would know what kind of a distraction this would be, not just for him, but for both of them. Despite Beth's hardened expression, he suspected that somewhere deep inside she felt the same level of distraction he felt. Ahead of them, a man approached, snapping David out of his thoughts. As he passed beyond the rim of light provided by the torches on the walls, the man lifted a self-lighting torch from a clip on his belt and pulled down the sliding handle on its side. The top of the torch roared to life. When the light poured over him, David could see that the man appeared to be around 40, with disheveled hair and a worried look on his face. In stark contrast from his hair, his clothes were relatively new and maintained the style of the day, but in black, where David's clothes were brown. As the man approached them, he held the torch well out in front of himself. "Hold there," the man called out. "Who are you? We don't get many strangers here." David found this to be in line with how everyone reacted, but contrary to what Tiberius had said. Some time between Tiberius receiving intelligence about this town and their arrival, something had changed. Naturally, he suspected Tepish involvement. "Please," David said, "can you help us?" "I asked who you are, and I expect an answer," the man demanded. "Forgive me," David said. "We've been walking for a while." "Names," the man said. "My name is David," David called out. "This is my wife, Elizabeth." Beth gave him a brief curtsy. "And why are you here?" the man asked. "We heard," David began. "We heard we could find refuge." The man narrowed his eyes. "Refuge from what?" he asked warily. "We were attacked by a vampire," David stuttered. "He carried us to a city over there." David pointed back toward Aram. "They told us things that we didn't believe at first, and I still have trouble believing it all." "What kinds of things?" the man asked, clearly unwilling to admit to anything yet. David could do little but play along. After all, they were supposed to be new to this world, so the common Fempiror knowledge of well-lit towns at night being home to Fempiror would not be something he would know yet. "Please, sir," David said, continuing his cover story, "we cannot go home. Our family and friends will turn against us and kill us." "Why would they do that?" the man asked. "Because," David began. He knew how silly he must sound to this Fempiror, but he remembered thinking this himself right after he was changed. "Because I think we got changed into vampires. We cannot survive in the daylight. I don't know what we're going to do." "Sir, we heard of your refuge for lost souls and came to seek your help," Beth pleaded convincingly. The man studied them suspiciously. His reaction reminded David of how the people of Hoggenstown usually reacted to newcomers. But then, no one ever said that Hoggenstown openly welcomed a lost Fempiror either. "Very well," the man said, and David felt himself breathe a sigh of relief. "I am Obadiah Masura, the mayor of the night dwellers here in Kelïrum. The normal people are mayored by Paul Stalick. They have given us amnesty here and do not persecute. You will find that these are a rare people." "Thank you, sir," David said. Obadiah signaled to a young man standing next to the closest building, which was about 10 yards behind Obadiah. The man was in his early 20s with brown hair, brown eyes, and very plain clothing. He wore a simple shirt and pant with no shoes or stockings. "Harrison here will help you find a place to rest until proper quarters may be found," Obadiah said. "We do welcome lost Fempiror, which is what you are, as vampires don't exist. But times have changed as of late, and there is much distrust among our people." "Why is that?" David asked. Obadiah shook his head. "I'm sure you've come far," he said. "Aram is some distance, and no doubt you're exhausted from trying to get here as quickly as possible. When did you leave?" David thought quickly about his cover story versus how long it should have taken to reach Kelïrum from Aram. "Yesterday night," David replied. "We had to hide during the day, but once the sun went back down, we tried to get here as soon as we could." Obadiah nodded, satisfied with David's answer. "Well, then you must be ready to find repose," he said again. "Just follow Harrison." David wondered why he was trying so hard to get rid of them, but thought he had better play along for now. David and Beth both thanked Obadiah and then followed young Harrison across town. David noticed Beth had turned her head slightly, her eyes looking hard behind her. David guessed she was watching Obadiah. Without a word, she turned back to watching Harrison. David wondered what she had seen, but he knew he could not ask until they were alone. A glance ahead showed that Harrison was leading them to an inn that stood near the borders of the town called the Kelïrum Inn. It was a simple 2-story box-shaped wood building that appeared to have the space for half a dozen rooms, and maybe up to a dozen if they were small. David was not expecting lavish accommodations, but if this was a free lodging for transients until they could acquire permanent lodgings, then the existence of such a place was rather admirable. Harrison led them up a pair of steps and across a narrow porch through a single door into the building. Harrison never spoke, nor did he turn to David or Beth as they walked. He clearly did a job for the mayor and asked no questions. The interior of the inn was as simple as David expected. A short hall with a counter on his left marked the entryway. Halls spread to the left and right just past the counter, as well as a stairway leading to the second floor. The walls and floor were primarily unpainted wood, though there was a carpet on the floor to dress up the entryway a little bit. Unlike the street, candles and sconces on the walls lit the lobby of the inn. An older woman walked out of the room behind the counter and smiled upon seeing them. She wore a simple dress much like Beth's, and looked to be in her 60s with gray hair tied behind her head in a bun. "Good evening, Harrison," she said with a grandmotherly smile. "New arrivals?" Her voice was friendly without a trace of malice or suspicion about her. No doubt, this served to set any new arrivals who had suffered the recent trauma of transmutation at ease. "Yes, Miss Fiona," Harrison replied, "straight from Aram." "Oh, poor things," Fiona said. "So young, too. I can take solace in my life after the change, but these young ones make me sad." "How many young ones have there been, ma'am?" David asked. "Oh, you can call me Miss Fiona, dear," Fiona said. "There have been dozens. Goodness, we have grown. Those Aram people certainly stay busy. It is a wonder they haven't rooted us out yet." "Why don't they?" Beth asked. "To be honest, dearie, I don't know," Fiona said. "Maybe we're just not that big a threat to them since they got their way with us. Besides, I worry that they might come after the unchanged people." "True," David said as Fiona turned to a board behind the counter. She retrieved a key and handed it to David. "Here you go, dearie," she said. "It's on the second floor to your right." David thanked her and turned with Beth to the stairs. They had taken a couple of steps when he heard Fiona sigh and say, "It's a shame, really." Curious, David stopped and turned to her. "What's a shame?" he asked. "It's just," Fiona began and then shrugged. "You two would have made such beautiful children." David felt Beth stiffen next to him. He glanced at her. She was looking at Fiona through eyes that were quickly filling with tears. She quickly turned and walked up the stairs, leaving David alone. He watched her go. "Forgive me," Fiona said, her voice reflecting an honest and heartfelt apology. "I didn't mean to upset her." David turned to her. He knew Fiona had meant no insult or offense, but like Beth, he was beginning to feel the weight of his past finally crashing down on him. "Don't worry," he told her. "It's just all so new for us." Fiona nodded as David followed Beth up the stairs. He met her at the top. She averted her eyes from him, but he could see that they were tear-stained and bloodshot from what Fiona had just dropped on her, as innocently as Fiona may have meant it. Of course, there was no other way to take the comment but personally. Even though they were on a mission, they had planned on children together once upon a time, and since Beth had refused to face the loss of their old life as much as David had, someone finally hitting her with the reality of it all was a lot to bear. "How are you doing?" David asked gently. "Let's just find our room," she clipped. David nodded and checked the key tag. The room number was 202. A line of faded, deep green carpet provided the only color in the short hall that comprised the second floor that held 5 rooms. Directly ahead of them was 203. He looked to his right and found 201 on the same side of the hall as the stairs, and the rooms were numbered sequentially counterclockwise from there, which placed 202 to the right of 203, then 204, and finally 205 directly to his left across the hall from 204. Candles burned in sconces between each of the 3 doors ahead of him. He walked to 202, unlocked the door, and held the door open for Beth to enter. He entered the small, sparsely furnished room behind her, and noticed that the room was so small that the door was only inches from the end of the bed. He inched into the room behind Beth, and looked around, using only the light from the hall. The room had no windows, of course, and the only furnishings were a double bed, which took up the majority of the floor space, and a small table with a half-burned candle in a holder beside the head of the bed. As he walked around the foot of the bed, he spotted a white chamber pot just under the edge of the bed. While Aram had cisterns with water to flush one's waste into the underground sewers, most smaller towns David had encountered still used chamber pots, though they usually had more privacy than this one allowed. The floor was very plain, unfinished wood, though well worn from use, and the bed had a very basic wooden frame with respectable, though well-used bedclothes. Like Hoggenstown, Kelïrum clearly sustained itself, but it appeared that new items were rare. Beth immediately walked to the bed and sat down, staring at the floor. David walked to the small table and placed his rucksack on the floor next to it. He looked at the tallow candle through the dim lighting and found a small tinderbox next to it. The thought of using a tinderbox again to produce light reminded David of just how much he enjoyed the conveniences of the Fempiror. Knowing that using the candles in the hall would produce a light quicker than using the tinderbox, he took the candle in its holder to the hall, used the candle in the sconce next to his room to light it, and returned to the room, finally closing the door behind him. He returned the candle holder to the table beside the bed, and then turned to look at Beth. "I don't know what's wrong with me," she said, barely able to speak past her grief. "I've survived the last 10 years without so much as a tear for what I've lost. Now I'm just a mess." "Maybe you're finally facing what you've ignored all this time," he said carefully. She chuckled and reclined on the bed. "Maybe I am." She sniffled, ran her hands down her face to recover some level of composure before looking at him. "David, why did you have to come back into my life?" she asked with a trace of anger. "Neither one of us asked for this, but," David began. He looked around the room. Beth yawned. "What?" she asked him, the yawn still in her voice. He was uncertain how to begin. The room only had one bed, and not only was there the question of their not really being married, but their past made him wonder just how comfortable she would be in sharing a bed with him. After she had yawned, she had shifted her body in the bed to lie on the side of the bed next to the wall. He noted that this did allow him room in the bed, but he was not sure whether she had done this intentionally or subconsciously. Still, considering the arrangements, either they had to share or he would have to sleep on the floor. Not having enough information as to how things worked around here, if someone checked on them in the middle of the day, these people might find it odd for them to be sleeping separately. How does one balance respectability with keeping up appearances? "How are we going to handle the sleeping arrangements?" he finally asked, just to be sure. "We're supposed to appear married, so there may be a respectable way to—" He turned back to Beth and found that she was already asleep. He was not sure if it was the trip or just the emotional turmoil she had recently experienced, but she rested peacefully on top of the bedclothes, fully dressed. David walked to her sleeping form and gazed upon her. He remembered the only other time he had seen her asleep, he had nearly decided to leave her room without saying goodbye. She was wearing this dress as well. Only yesterday he had seen her for the first time in 10 years and wanted nothing more than to talk to her. Now they were together in a small inn, dressed as they were before they ever changed, looking the age they would have been if life had allowed them to marry and live out their lives together. David's world spun around him as his alternative life flashed before his eyes. A honeymoon at an inn far from home, their first night together, the prospect of a long life with children followed by grandchildren, living the life of a tailor at some little town away from Hogginstown. He reflected that the tailor life would not have been so bad, whatever he might have thought of it then. 10 years of combat training and fighting Tapish gave him a new appreciation of the simple life. He looked back at his former fiancée and decided that he could sleep respectably beside her to keep up their appearance. Carefully, he removed her shoes and lifted the bedclothes from his side of the bed to cover her. The bedclothes were of little concern to him, as he normally opted to go without. Since his body temperature was usually colder than the air around him, he rarely needed them to stay warm when he slept. He removed his shoes, turned to the candle, and snuffed it, extinguishing the light. He lay down next to her on the bed and closed his eyes. He listened intently to the inn outside the room. Someone was at the door. The person was quiet, but he shifted his weight now and again, so David suspected he was kneeling, probably looking through the keyhole. It made David that much more relieved that he decided to sleep next to her. He was momentarily concerned that this person might have heard him talking about appearing to be married, but thinking back, David thought he had heard something when he was standing next to the bed after Beth had fallen asleep. He had thought nothing of it at the time, but in this context, he suspected that was when the keyhole peeper showed up. As he listened, the person got to his feet and walked away from the door. He and Beth were alone again. He closed his eyes and let sleep take him.